let's go back. Actually, let's move towards your book, The Archeologies of Touch. Amazing book. I really enjoyed reading it. And I really love how you organize the history of touch and tactile interfaces or haptic interfaces. And by the way, I think that's you brought up very important thing, that we should distinguish tactile versus haptics, right? One is active, another is a passive touch, because usually in industry it's kind of used interchangeably. So maybe sometimes I will use haptic, but I mean tactile interface. So just because it's already kind of overused like that in the industry. Anyways, in this book, you organize the history of tactile technology through 5 phases, right? So would you be able to kind of describe each phase using 1 to 2 sentences for our audience? I think it would be really nice to have this like express history excursus to tactile sense and interfacing.
Yeah, let me take a shot at that. So the first phase, which I sort of date to roughly the 1740s, maybe like an odd starting point for a history of haptic interfaces. But for me, that first phase is defined by the use of touch to know and apprehend and study electricity. So electricity is this thing that's very hard for people to understand in the 1700s. One of the ways that they understand it, one of the ways that they know it, is by touching it, and it is electricity is uniquely accessible to touch in comparison to the other senses. So electricity has this cultural life in the 1700s and on into the 1800s, and that cultural life is in some ways defined by its touchability. What happens when I feel an electric shock? What happens when I feel an electric eel? What happens when I feel an electric battery? What does that do to my body? So that's the first phase, basically a tactile epistemology, knowing electricity through touch. It's a very structured way of touching electricity. And the second phase begins roughly in the 1820s with the experiments by Ernst Heinrich Weber on tactility. He's interested in mapping the 2-point threshold on the skin, so that the smallest difference, the smallest distance at which you can perceive a distance between 2 stimuli. That really sort of creates the basis for a system of experiments, scientific experiments on touch carried out throughout the 19th century, continuing on into the 20th century. And then at the end of the 19th century, they come up with a name for that, or they use an old name for that. They use this word haptics to describe the doctrine of touch. And for me, that's really sort of this crucial moment when you get the coherence of a formal field of inquiry, a formal field of study around touch. So haptics for me is, very much a 19th century science that gains new life in the 20th century. The third phase is defined by a series of attempts that is specifically drawing on that science of touch to create new communication technologies, electric mechanical communication technologies, informed by the science of touch to route communication messages through the skin. So whether that's messages originally intended for the ear that are routed through the hand, messages originally intended through the eye that are routed through the skin, or Frank Gildard's tactile Morse code vibratese that he develops in the 1950s. So this is, roughly the 1920s onward. And I should say that that these phases, so they're successive, but they're not, one phase doesn't necessarily end and another one begins. They sort of overlap in a lot of interesting and productive ways. And obviously this is contestable too, right? This is just my way of organizing this history. Someone else might go at it and hit it another way. The fourth phase dates back to the late 1960s and involves attempts at adding touch feedback onto existent modes of interfacing with computers. So how can we productively add touch feedback onto an audiovisual interface, allowing us to touch and feel objects in computer-generated space? And this is really sort of the precursor to contemporary, VR force feedback gloves. Basically, a series of sustained attempts, primarily in university context, but also in industry context, to add touch feedback onto computers. This really accelerates in the 1980s and 1990s We get the fifth phase roughly in the early 2000s, but probably dated a little bit before that, which involves attempts to convince the public. This is like, how do we bring this technology to market? And this involves attempts to convince the public that there's a need for haptic interfaces, right? That the production of desire for haptic interfaces. How do we convince you that this is something that is essential and fundamental and missing in your life, and you have to have it? So that's basically the skeletal outline of the book. And I would say at this point, I'm confident that we could even add a sixth phase.
That's what I wanted to ask.
Sure.
Can you predict?
Yeah, I mean, I would say this is not even a prediction, but almost more of an observation that something does happen. I stopped research for the book roughly in 2015, so that's where it closes. I think something crucial happens with this recent rediscovery of VR and the bringing a new wave of products to market, which we've seen just in the last 5 or so years. This is really sort of a testing ground for a lot of the technology that was developed, from the 1980s on. It's a testing ground for a lot of the marketing discourse around touch. We only had, a few dedicated haptics devices prior to 2015 that were actually brought to, mass market. And we've seen a lot more of them, subsequent to 2017. So I think we're in this sort of new phase of testing the public interest and the public desire for these technologies. And we're going to see, how much these efforts succeed and how much they sort of fail over the next few years.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Are you planning to continue actually the history, writing about this? Like as
Yeah,
it goes,
definitely.
or what's your plan?
Yeah, I mean that's sort of where I'm at now. I'm really trying to get my head around. I mean, it's hard to study technology, emerging technology as it's emerging. It's a lot easier to go back and look historically at it, and to sort of take a moving snapshot of the field in progress. But I think it's a really exciting time to be studying the technology, just because you have so much stuff being thrown against the wall to see what sticks at this point. There's what, 3 or 4 haptic vests currently commercially available. That was not true a decade ago, right? So they use different configurations of stimuli. They use, some use vibrations, some use electricity. Which one of those is going to, if one of them wins out, which one is it going to be? There's incredibly fascinating questions. I don't have a great answer for which one is going to win out, but I think it's really interesting to track, how that technology emerges and where its uses, where it finds its uses.
And also the acceptance changes, right? So it's more acceptable to have some wearable devices than it was before, right? We have the whole industry of electronic textiles, right? Creating like, do-it-yourself industry that creates all kind of, garments with some, of course, simple vibration motors and all other modalities. But I guess society is more ready to accept certain things.